Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. Impetus Digital builds some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools for life science and healthcare companies. We actually help companies virtualize their in-person meetings, be it investigator meetings, clinical study development, medical education, advisory boards. And since COVID-19, we've helped a lot of clients do things like their brand plan rollouts and sales and MSL training. But most importantly, at Impetus Digital, we really believe that everything starts with a thought. And then from a thought comes a conversation. And these are the kinds of conversations we're trying to emulate here. And why is really the reason behind the podcast that we're doing here is that we want to delve into these big, hairy, audacious conversations with the provocateurs, the people like the Ramsay Browns of the world, who are doing some of the leading edge and the bleeding edge things so that we can all collectively work to positively disrupt healthcare as we know it today. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to have one of those thinkers at the table, Ramsay Brown. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He is actually the director of product science at Applied VR. And he's also the founder and CEO of a company called Quol. So we're going to be spending more of our time talking about that today and kind of digging in around that. It's an innovation advisory firm. And he works at the intersection of brains, minds, and machines. So kind of a cool place to be sort of lingering on. He uses design, he uses systems neuroscience and code to explore the interface between us and our increasingly intelligent artifacts. So his work is driven by the modernist conviction that we can build our way to a greater human thriving. And he is absolutely enthralled by the reciprocal casuality between humans and machines. So the great cyborg and the implications of their ever poorly defined boundary. So we're going to kind of dig into that and what that future looks like. So look out, Elon Musk and Neuralink. He has a master's degree in neuroinformatics from the University of Southern California. We were just talking about that. He's a big surfer. And prior to his current roles, he was the co-founder and chief operating officer of a startup called Boundless Mind. Welcome, Ramsay. So thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thrilled to be here.
We were just talking earlier. So Ramsay actually lives in Southern California, but he really does take this fireside chat to the next level, as I'm sure you do, Ramsay, about everything in your life, being the wonderful surfer dude that you are. But before we get into all of that, I'd love for you to share with this group this really interesting trajectory that you've had in your life that has kind of caused you to land in all these really neat places in the kind of the digital space and and how you kind of landed where you are today.
Thanks so much. Absolutely. Now, I'd be remiss not to point out that a lot of people who end up doing technical work, especially as founders, end up with these semi-obnoxious life arc stories where they kind of knew what they wanted to do since they were a kid. And I'm not going to escape that gravity well. That totally happened to me. But I've always had this it's terrible. But I've always had this really deep passion since contracting pneumonia at a really young age, which put me in a medical context pretty quickly, that the thing I was supposed to do with my very scarce time here was work at this intersection of technology and human flourishing. And I always found the place where that resonated the best was understanding how what we were doing with computing, because my dad was in the first dot-com wave in the 90s. So I grew up with a lot of early exposure to the first wave of what would become the internet. What we were doing with technology and what medicine was beginning to think about in terms of things like systems neuroscience and understanding that the parts of us that are most Ramsay and most Natalie can be thought of analogously to how we thought about networks and how we thought about computing infrastructure. And that kind of became the loci of my passion throughout my life. So how do we build things that helped people flourish at that intersection of technology and life sciences, but particularly aiming at human behavior? I followed that into my graduate studies at University of Southern California, where I built a Google Maps for the brain. So instead of clicking and dragging around a map to figure out how you drive between Market Street and the Presidio, figuring out instead how does the brain conduit information from different pieces, and how do we click and drag around a map like that to get between, say, smell and memory. Um, that helped me cut my teeth on design thinking and understanding software development. Built my first company, Dopamine Labs, then shortly after that. And we focused on how behavior change could be driven using artificial intelligence. And this was huge for us because going back to this imperative that we're here to use technology to improve human flourishing, if you talk to any physician, they'll tell you that I think it's about 7 of 10 common causes of death, leading causes of death in the United States, have strong behavioral components. These are the type 2 diabetes, the COPD, the cardiovascular disease, stroke, depression and anxiety and its stress complications. These are all places where you have genetic factors to be certain, but you also largely have behavioral factors. And as a neuroscientist who studied the parts of the brain about behavior, I understood deeply at a mechanistic level what it means to have the environment change around someone to drive a behavior to a new state. And what we saw was a massive opportunity to do good and use our phones that were otherwise being used as distraction and suffering engines instead to further patient adherence or to further how well people stuck to their diet or were mobile from a sedentary life or remembered to take their pills on time. Places where we could use technology to gear the sort of outcomes that medical technology was trying to drive, not starting from a medicine perspective, but starting from a human behavior perspective and working backwards.
So you bring up so many great nuggets there, Ramsey. Like I just almost need to double click on so many of them. So let me try to
Let's
see if
do
I can
it.
get started on some of the
Let's try.
cool, like little pearls there. But first of
Thanks.
all, dopamine drips. I mean, for those people who are not as familiar with this, tell us a little bit about the research and the work and the understanding you have around dopamine and how that works in the human body.
Right. So the brain and the nervous system has evolved dopamine as a molecule that your nervous system uses for adapting and directing goal oriented, motivated behavior in two particular ways. Your brain releases it when you're anticipating something that's going to happen, and anticipation feels good. And your brain releases it when something goes unexpectedly well. And if you have something that you do and it goes unexpectedly well, from an evolutionary perspective, you should do that thing more frequently, whether that was finding a food source or fresh water or a mate or shelter. If you think way back in our conserved vertebrate evolutionary history, we weren't living inside and tweeting for until very, very recently. We spent a lot of time in our evolutionary past needing to find out what was where and how to keep getting it. Scarcity defined our existence. And dopamine was a way our brains cobbled together to reinforce us for doing things that felt unexpectedly fantastic. And now, where we see this happening the most is that people who are working on behavioral engineering, most often in the smartphone apps that we use every day that define so much of our life, have understood that as long as they can give people a little dopamine hit while using the app, they're going to activate that very evolutionarily ancient part of the brain that changes what we want and what we focus on to keep people coming back in to keep getting that fix. So they're hacking an ancient wiring. Now, the ancient wiring isn't the problem. We share it with thousands of species that are also vertebrates. The problem is, what do we do with that? So, do we want that technology to be used for TikTok videos and destroying liberal democracy and, sensible discourse online, or do we want that technology to be used for helping people build habits that are more aligned with the sort of outcomes they want out of their own life?
So this is a really important point. I mean, obviously we're kind of, depending on when people end up listening to this or watching this is, we may have actually already chosen the president or, there could be a series of things that have happened since this discussion. But right now at this juncture, we're at this very sensitive period. A global pandemic, social upheaval, economic, destruction, and the list goes on, right? So this whole idea around conspiracy theories and dopamine drips and getting and kind of leveraging that deep-seated neural network of, brain neurons, which are basically, the question comes down to, are we just basically that Hebbian law, whatever fires together wires together, just basically a bunch of neurons? Um, the question comes down to is, and the fear that comes down to is the plug and play and the undercurrent, because we're hitting something, we're hitting those nerves, we're hitting the subconscious, that extra layer that we're not in the awareness piece, where we're being surveilled, where we're being manipulated. And this ultimately comes down to the fear and the need and the want to sort of uh, overshadow and regulate all of these scary, dopamine drip developing companies. So can you speak to the history behind that, and how, like you said, there's actual scientists, behavioral engineers who want to create havoc and really impinge on your emotional registry and get you fired up because it makes you stay in these apps longer. People are reticent. They're distrustful of that. So can you speak to that, and also based on the fact that in some ways that's what a lot of companies are doing?
Yeah, I can. And it's a fantastic question. And I think one that's coming to be one of the defining questions of our age, honestly. So I'll go back in two places. We'll go back to the biological history and we'll go back to the social media critical history. From the biological history, we've understood since the 50s and 60s that this subsystem in the brain that was releasing dopamine was involved in the direction of goal oriented motivated behavior, that you could drop an electrode in it and give rat the control of the electrode to push a button and the electrode would fire, and the rat would find the electrode pushing so stimulating that it would forego food, it would forego sex, it would forego sleep and water, and it would die with its hand on the button. Because not only did it feel fantastic, but the pressing of the button rewired the rat to continue to want to press the button. That's what our dopamine system does. It determines our future selves and what they want. So we've known about that for quite some time. When we think about it in the context of the technology we all inhabit now, I have to go back to Marshall McLuhan and his understandings in um, his classic criticisms on media and understanding media, the extensions of man. That when he understood the electric digital village and this idea that the medium would be the message, I think, while not foreshadowing this, I think we've had a good critical theory understanding for quite some time that if you develop a platform that lets people communicate in very small bites, they're only going to communicate very small ideas. And you're going to select for things that are emotionally evocative, but very information poor. And I think that's what we're seeing now for a lot of the trends you're describing. A lot of what we're seeing in digital contexts, whether it's completely asinine conspiracy theories or medical misinformation relating to the pandemic, is that because the platforms, the medium, is constrained to favor high affective content and low informational content, they become natural breeding grounds for those types of ideas to be spread. When I fast forward then from McLuhan, I think the next philosopher in line is Jaron Lanier for his fantastic books, of which You Are Not a Gadget is probably one of my favorites. His description that the underlying problem here is that of incentive structure with these large tech companies that are controlling and building so much of the platform that all of our lives are happening in. And I have to give them the benefit of the doubt that I don't think that it's a group of evil cabal adjacent people wringing their hands as they plot the demise of civilization, as much as a group of people who are beholden to a set of incentives placed on them by their shareholders. The reality is that the only thing that Facebook wants is the value of Facebook stock to go up, and it's going to do whatever it has to within the realms of regulation and not poisoning its own brand to get that to happen. So when it finds itself responsible for, due to poor content moderation guidelines, ethnic cleansings, or the destruction of public discourse, it didn't do those things because it's evil. It did those things because it's under a set of very, very poor incentives that are toxically aligned with what people really want. That itself is something we need to change. That itself ought to be the point of regulation, and making these companies that have come to dominate our daily lives behave more like utilities and less like, Blockbuster was able to 20 years ago, which is how they still want to call themselves. Is we're just this fun thing you do, as opposed to we're the backbone of 90% of the communication you have in your daily life. We need to start treating them like that so we can better realign the incentives they're under. Realigning those incentives then will change the pressures they're under to behave, and that will change the outcomes we get as people and the types of ideas that are allowed to propagate in these systems.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So many brilliant ideas and thoughts and provocations there for sure. We are in the middle of this unprecedented pandemic, COVID-19, an
By the way,
accelerant
Natalie,
of change.
Natalie, how badly do you miss precedented times? I miss them so badly. Oh my God, I would trade anything to go back to precedented times if I have to hear unprecedented times one more time.
Absolutely. Good point. Good point. We're in the place where we just don't have we don't have the right heuristics. I mean, we're relying on things and behaviors of past history in a new world of newness. And so we're bringing these biases in these algorithms into a place that it may not necessarily work anymore, but it's all we know. And so in this COVID world that we're in this quote unquote hashtag new normal, we're suddenly faced with newness. We're, a groundswell of difference. Some of us are thriving and some of us are just absolutely in a terrible place. And so when we're talking about these dopamine drips and we're talking about behavioral engineering, is we have to sort of ask ourselves in the healthcare space, besides all of the other stimulus package and all the things we're trying to do on the surface and the tip of the iceberg around economics and general healthcare management, is the underlying, the structures, the mental models, the belief systems, and the myriad of things that might be going on from a mental health standpoint. Addiction, food disorders, all kinds of other rampant mental issues and disorders and conditions. And then the effects that those things, like social isolation, social distancing, is going to have in people's lives around, for months, weeks, years forthcoming, is how do we leverage these neural network, these algorithms, and changing the discourse away from, the evil brother of, manipulation and surveillance into something of positivity, of taking these negative spirals that people are in and pulling them into a place of normalcy, or at least for them, whatever normal means, or into a place of creating meditative habits or other things. So can you speak a little bit about the salvation of these kinds of technologies?
I will, absolutely. I think your question breaks down in two pieces, and I'm going to address them independently. First is one that people can do, that any listener, what they can do for their mental health in times like this. And the second is then, as innovators, what companies who are seeking to build at the edge can do to be supportive of this change. So the first piece about what people can do, and I'm going to disclaim that I'm not a medical professional and this in no way constitutes medical advice. But what we have found is that the people who build social media, the companies that are creating Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, have a pretty adequate understanding that the technology they've built makes people miserable. It isn't 2008 anymore. We can't pretend that these things are new and exciting. It isn't this cheeky, you get to catch up with your friends. We've come to spend most of our time living inside these digital spaces, and they are architectured to make us uncomfortable and miserable. We know this because they've run controlled experiments that have been leaked to demonstrate that they are capable of changing people's behavior. And there have been leaked internal memos showing that high leadership teams at these platforms understand that people are suffering inside of them, and then chose to make no meaningful changes to how they operate on the heels of that information. So if you or someone you know is suffering for being plugged in constantly to these machines designed to make us suffer emotionally. As a technologist who is increasingly becoming more and more analog himself, I would suggest that there's nothing wrong with unplugging. There's nothing wrong with taking a step back. In fact, quite the opposite. There's probably everything in the world to gain for unplugging and taking a step back. These places are designed to be high engagement rage cages. They're not the library. They're not your friend. They don't want what you want. They're not truth. They're not information. They're a theater of noise, and they're designed to get you riled up like that because that's how they make their advertising money. So dip, get out. That's going to be a godsend to mental health. So that from a personal perspective, what people can do, take less time on the net, get out. The news cycle and the anxiety panic checking, whether it's about riots or ecology or politics or the pandemic itself, you're not at the place where more information is going to help you make a better decision. You absolutely have enough information. Part of the crippling problem of 2020 is that we're just powerless against so many of these large forces that are making our day-to-day lives very different than what we would have sought them to be. And that powerlessness is a thing that can be understood and accepted and worked through. But more information is not what we need. So get out, get off. You owe it to yourself. You deserve better than it. What I would say for those who are seeking to be innovators in this space is that a lot of the tools and techniques from behavioral engineering and from artificial intelligence that these platforms have built in the past decade now are being democratized in the form of open source platforms and packages that make it easier and easier every year to develop with them. And should that be aligned well with an understanding of what people really need in their lives, what people really want in order to flourish, those can be really powerful tools in accelerating quality of life. And that's a lot of why we started Quol as an organization, was to take these tools from the keep, so to speak, and liberate them out into teams that were seeking to actually do good against what people really wanted. We start with the UN set of sustainable development goals as our so-called to-do list, so to speak, of what the greater global us really is up against. And an application of these emerging technologies towards the ends of what people actually care about: quality health and well-being, adequate access to water and sanitation, climate action, inequality, sustainable living in their cities. Those are the things people really want. No one really wants, per se, a fifth Uber clone or another Postmates knockoff. People would love to have a better voice in local representative democracy. So, or people would really love to have digital therapeutics that actually helped them change their state of mind and well-being. There are things people really do want that would improve their quality of life. And it's up to innovators and technologists to align these infinitely powerful forms of how with an empathetic and humanitarian understanding of why. No one cares that you got a computer science degree at Stanford if all you can think of to build is another stupid app. Like, you have to figure out what people actually want, what's actually improving quality of life, because at the end of the day, that's all that everyone's after.
Really, really interesting stuff. And in that process, we are moving into a greater and greater digital world. You were mentioning digital therapeutics. We're talking about entire agencies like the FDA, and the NIH and, Health Canada and others completely modulating. So they're creating new divisions on these digital therapeutics, software as a medical device, and on the list goes on. So we're moving in this direction. And part of this process comes the ever-arching question is, do we, as an analog entity walking around in this world, do I increase my performance and my ability my ability to be able to function in this increasingly digital world by tapping in, becoming part of the collective consciousness, of becoming a cog in the greater world, in the internet utility that's lying out there, the utility of artificial intelligence. And part of that comes the scary question is, do we just become part of a machine? And what does that look like? I think I was joking with you earlier about the Neuralink, which is that silicon you know,
Yep.
insertion that, would be placed in your brain so that you can actually do all kinds of wonderful things, be able to walk and talk as a
Yeah, I mean,
paraplegic, if
I'll
somebody who's
say it. I'll
blind.
say it now. I can think of nothing scarier than handing a bored Twitter happy billionaire direct access to Cortex. I can't think of any scarier thought.
So we're sort of at this precipice, because on the one hand, we want to move forward. We realize that, we can't go back. But at the same time, it asks the question is, what does that look like?
Yeah.
How
So
do we manage this and what does consciousness actually mean? What does it mean to be human? Because you keep referring to a reality around everybody wants these things. This is a quality of life, but is that really the single truth?
right. No, you've asked like 5 good questions in one. So we'll work backwards through them. So, Qual takes its namesake from quality of life. And it dawned on us that my co-founder and I, that what we really needed to do was pin down an adequate definition of quality of life. And having come from biological sciences, I'm a big fan of elegance, not just in ball gowns per se, but in solutions to problems that hide complexity and simplicity. So I think we have an elegant answer, but I won't toot my own horn on it. I'll let you make that assessment. I think quality of life is a measure of the inverse of the gap. So if the gap is big, quality of life is small. And if the gap is small, quality of life is big. But it's the inverse of the gap between the life I currently lead and the life I would seek to lead.
Mm.
Now, I like this answer because it doesn't say anything about your access to drinking water or whether or not you got to watch Netflix today. Rather, it places the loci of control of the definition of quality of life in our hands, but it
Mm.
does point out that what is universal is whether I am currently in a war-torn region like Yemen or the Sahel, or I'm in a factory town that automation and globalization have abandoned, or I'm bored but in the suburbs, or I'm well and live in a tent on the beach and I've chosen this life. All of those things get captured by this gap between my aspirations and my current way I live my life. So we find this to be a flexible answer that encompasses everything ranging from civil liberties to quality of mental health. So I
I
think that,
love that. I think that's my assessment is that's a phenomenal response, and I love the
thank you.
flexibility of it.
Because it lets people kind of determine that. And it doesn't make any normative statements about what quality of life has to include, other than people tend to have good both personal and community understandings what makes their life good. So I still hold that what people are after is quality of life. And sometimes quality of life means being famous on TikTok. Good luck. And sometimes quality of life means malaria nets. Hopefully we can make some progress there. And you can have people who live in countries that have a very high Gini coefficient and very low GDP per capita. And they have very high quality of life because the gap between how they would seek to live and how they do live is very small. And you can go to countries that have a very low Gini coefficient and very high GDP per capita, and you have miserable teenagers in the suburbs wondering why they're not yet a Kardashian. They have very low quality of life. So we find it a flexible answer.
It is. It's
Uh,
fantastic.
but
Yeah.
you've asked me the most fascinating question I've been asked in a while about like it's the and I'll pretend you didn't ask me what consciousness is because I'm not qualified because I don't know who is. That's coming from a kind of a neuroscientist and a philosopher. But this question of like what should we want out of our relationship with machinery? And the description that you read of me is accurate. That I spend a lot of my time thinking about this. That since we live so much in increasingly digital contexts, we are increasingly becoming more and more digital ourselves. In that we now have there was this phase that my mother, bless her soul, like went through in the early 90s when my dad first brought home a computer where she rolled her eyes and says, those are dumb, that's never taken off. And then when we get internet installed in the house in the 90s, and she's like, what am I going to use that for? That's never taking off. And then sees a smartphone and says, what, that's never taking off. And I love it because it's like without fail been this understanding that technology was that thing over there and civilization was us over here. And these gadgets were always just going to be gadgets. That's not the case anymore. Like I remember being young and going to the computer lab at school where you got to use the computers for 20 minutes a week. And that was like exciting and different. And now the joke is, if you talk to any millennial, their best day of the week is the one day they were allowed to not look at their computer, because that's just the life we occupy now. Um, Whether or not more and more of our communication and work and play happens in digital contexts is orthogonal to a question about our deep personal, philosophical, and like existential relationship with computing and machinery. I can't think of anything more frightening than direct biological interface with computing. Like, it's bad enough that I have to keep my phone in black and white mode, remove all notifications, delete apps from it constantly, and put in airplane mode half the day so I can focus on enjoying my life or getting good work done. The idea that you're going to jam that into Cortex and I truly have no escape is about as dystopian of a thought as humanly possible. It's come to us from science fiction, from fantastic tropes, from promises that it will do the same thing that all labor saving devices do, that it'll ease human toil and it'll increase civil liberties. And we will find ourselves that surely, here's what it is. It is in John Maynard Keynes, one of his essays shortly before becoming John Maynard Keynes, said that automation was going to reduce human toil, and he could not imagine a worker in the 21st century working more than a few hours per week, because that's what the automation was for. Surely it is a brain implant that is that final step we needed to truly free us from all toil. No, it's complete crap. It's going to do nothing but further collapse the human condition into one of total homogeneity and subjugation. So I'm actually aggressively opposed to consumer neural interfaces and an increasing and creeping role that these machines play in our daily lives, how we think, communicate, pray, love, work, all of these things. Um, I'm I'm a technologist. I'm an innovation advisor. I spend as much time away from technology as I can, because technology is a means to an end, not an end. And a cultural fetishization performed by Silicon Valley in the past decade has convinced us that what we wanted was more gadgetry in our lives. And we wanted more apps and we wanted more convenience. And through this process of, uh, what's the exact word I'm looking for? Of co-opting our dreams and our hopes and our identities and our communities, feeding them willingly into these communication platforms and these technologies, we've forgotten that the whole time we were the thing being sold. Your data, your personality, your hopes, your fears, your sex, your love, your play, your desires, your bills, everything being strip mined and exploited and aggregated with the data points of millions of other people for the purpose of improving the value of a piece of stock you don't own. All of
But
this is how.
here's the interesting question about all of this, Ramsay, is that may be
Mhm.
the general sentiment of the greater population. I mean, who wants to be having their entire life and their doors open and their closets open for the world to observe and to judge? I mean, most people would agree with that. But that's actually just the tip of the iceberg. As I was mentioning, most things are really delving more into what's underneath that. So we only see what we see, we only know what we know. And that's really what the scary part about all of it is. So
Yeah.
even though we may not be relegating to having that neural circuitry embedded into our cranium, we can be suddenly, through what we call ambient biometrics and through just keyboard sensations or facial recognition software that will eventually get downloaded onto screens of computers, information being funneled, across the board and refined and utilized. And you can actually flip the story. It can be negatively used, or we can say, this is actually how we're going to be able to manage population health
Mhm.
and be able to read the
Totally.
sensation from your skin that, such and such triggers cause migraines or high blood pressure, or flush in the
Yeah.
face means this. So so how do we, even though we may not get the embed into our brains, is this technological progression going to happen regardless if we've tapped in or
No.
agreed or
No.
voted for it?
It totally is not. And that's one of the most interesting questions that you did ask that I wanted to get to. Um, It is like perennially the school of the dude who only skims through The Economist, or the kid who only like half attended class in business school, to say that Schumpeter's creative destruction is inevitable and all technological progress must happen and everything that can be built will be built, is patently false. We recall that in the past 100 years, we both invented nuclear arms and then dismantled most of them. We literally built the ability to split the atom for warfare and then looked around at how boneheaded of a thing we did at existential risk levels and strategically disarmed most of the population of nuclear arms that we built in the 60s. That's a massive victory for quality of life and human flourishing globally and existential risk. But it's also a really poignant factor that, like, look, your smartphone collecting data on you is much, much smaller of a problem than nuclear arms. And we were able to turn around from that big thing. We can turn around from Amazon surveillance. Like, these are easy things. We're currently lacking political will, and we're substituting convenience and low cost for making sensible decisions strategically about our long-term well-being. But we are able to turn around. We are in charge of what gets built. We don't have to pretend that the invisible hand is such a palpable, touchable thing that it surely will make us wake up one morning and totally change course in our lives. No, we are what society is made of. We are in charge of this, and we do get to determine what gets built. I think about the role that Europe has played in the past year, even. I know we've all had to roll our eyes at GDPR compliance, but the reality is, at a regulatory level, leveler heads than ours looked around and said, "This stops here and now." And at impact, when it's mature, GDPR is going to be the cause of a safer data world in Europe than we're going to get to experience here unless we enact analogous legislation. So we do see that we are able to turn some of these things around. We are able to align them with where they're good. We probably need to stop putting up with the company of what's probably going to be the world's first trillionaire trying to build medical products, because that's pretty poorly aligned with what we actually want out of our lives in terms of incentive structures. But those who do have a stake in us actually being well beyond us being able to afford buying more shit from him should be trusted to, with regulation, build out these types of technologies. There's nothing
I
that
was just
scares me.
listening. It's funny that you said, I was just listening to a podcast with Chatham, Halley what's his name? Pali Hapatia. Sorry, he's the guy who owns Social Capital. He was saying
Yeah,
that he
yeah.
believes the first trillionaire is going to be somebody who's dealing in climate change. So it's funny that you
Oh, thank
mentioned
God. Great. I pray to God it's not Jeff. The last thing Jeff needs is more money and power. But the point is still there, that when someone whose business model is predominantly data and selling stuff tells me that they have a medical device for me too, a sensible person's answer should be to run. When an organization better aligned with my actual care outcomes and my quality of life tells me that they have an intelligent system that's able to take these ambient biometrics, we should be cautious but optimistic. So going back to regulation and incentive structures, I think is how we navigate a totally optional future where we have a lot more power than those who say invisible hand would like you to believe.
Absolutely. You do a lot of really interesting work in the company Quol, and for those of you listening, it's spelled Quol. So Quol, it's an advisory firm. And so, you sort of sit in this interesting place where you're kind of helping and advising companies on how to foster and think about artificial intelligence, and basically responsibility, how to manage it responsibly within their organization. So can you tell a little bit about what you do when a company comes to you, they're thinking about doing this, doing that? Tell us a little bit about how you talk about empowerment of leadership, how to manage risk and consider risk, and also some of your suggestions of implementing things like intelligence augmentation instead of artificial intelligence. So tell us a little bit about how you help companies through change management around AI.
Absolutely. So it's our belief that AI is going to be an exceptionally transformative technology for some of the largest companies on earth who really have the scale to both leverage the underlying data lakes that will be able to train AI systems and automation systems, but also have the greatest impact in our daily lives. But where corporate social responsibility maybe was 10 or 15 years ago, beginning to understand that these companies had a responsibility to not just shareholders, but stakeholders in terms of their ecological and social impact of doing business. We think too that how they use artificial intelligence needs to be looked at the same way. Just because it's made of software doesn't mean that the way to think about it is like the way we think about Zoom or Microsoft Excel. It's probably closer to how we think about a coal-fired power plant, in which this is going to be very profitable if we do it right, but it's also going to throw off a lot of externalities, and we have to discuss that. So we help firms navigate corporate AI responsibility, how they can, in a sustainable way, get long-term profitability out of their AI investment while mitigating the externalities against the upside. So the way we do this is we help them better understand at a first point how AI is working inside their firm. We explore with them where it either is in their development roadmap or currently implemented. We help them document their risks against common risk sources of where AI can do things, ranging from having an outsized and underdocumented ecological imprint. So I'll give an example. Training one language model has been shown to be as carbon creating as 157 round trip flights between New York and Beijing to train one neural network model,
Wow.
which is if your company currently has an understanding of, look, we're trying to hit emission targets by 2030 or 2050, comma, we're also investing in AI, you really need to look closely at the trade-offs you're making. So we help them document their ecological impact of AI. We help them understand how it can and cannot interfere with intrinsic biases that their organization currently holds, and how to either know and mitigate against those or remove them entirely. We help them manage where intelligence augmentation, the idea that there are types of software that can make humans smarter as opposed to replacing humans, can lower and mitigate their risk factors. We help them put change management policies in place. We don't expect everyone overnight to have a complete plan about how they're going to use AI sustainably, in the same way that firms say we're going to have by 2030 have these metrics we're going to hit. We help them understand how this rolls out over the course of years, and help them communicate that internally and make sure that their leaders better understand what sort of opportunities they have, and help the organization suss out which leaders are really well prepared to take advantage of sustainable solutions like this.
Brilliant. That just sounds masterful. And
Thank you.
so many people would probably could be using that kind of advisory service. So the other thing as well too is, part of this discussion is playing around with new tools and new algorithms and new your software, and AI is coming out every single day. There's something new. And one of the things that's obviously very exciting, especially in the healthcare space, is things like virtual reality, artificial reality, being used for immersive experiences, mixed reality, where people are, and patients specifically, are doing everything from clinical trial simulation. So, again, how do you get more patients being part of these clinical trials globally? Have them try it on, have them figure out what it feels like to be in an MRI, or to inject themselves subcutaneously, as an example. Um, Being able to manage through, a PTSD, experience, virtually through a VR headset and very safely. So can you speak a little bit around these kinds of technologies and how you work with some of the companies you consult with on navigating these things?
Absolutely. So virtual and extended reality therapeutics has been of interest to me for a while. I'm personally bearish on virtual reality as a consumer tool. Like I don't want to picture the world where my mom and dad think it's cool and normal to put on a VR headset as part of their daily life. That's probably a little dystopic, but as a really focused therapeutic, a industrial application here for the industry of care, I'm very bullish on that, especially when we think about diseases and conditions that have a really strong central nervous system role, whether that's, as you mentioned, post traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, talk therapy and CBT, or managing pain. My relationship as director of product science at a firm, Applied VR, has been focusing on is how do we use VR therapeutics to better help people manage and learn to live with and reduce the pain they're experiencing. To me, this is really exciting because it accomplishes a few of the aims of therapeutics simultaneously. We're able to compare it against a standard of care and demonstrate how extended reality and virtual reality can perform equally to or surpass in a standard of care what is currently being done. These can be done remotely, which pushes the point of care from a clinic to the home, which is the cheapest and safest point of care. These can, through the use of course, exceptionally compliant ways to collect and de-anonymize or to anonymize and depersonalize patient data, this can get us to a place where we're beginning to have avenues now of doing population level medicine because these interventions can adapt very quickly. Whereas it might have taken, decades to create a pharmaceutical, distribute it, or create a pharmaceutical, get it through a regulatory pathway, get it distributed, have it in enough patients and a population for a long time to collect outcomes from that, to then make an iteration on that pharmaceutical and then go through the process of getting through regulatory pathways again. uh, there are different ways that both therapeutics, but especially wellness products, which always have to exist adjacent to therapeutics, can take advantage of the fact that server communication time round trip between your VR headset and the cloud is going to be on the scale of milliseconds, which means that we're able to push down changes and improvements to the state of the art orders of magnitude faster than previously capable. Now, of course, because of the great acceleration that COVID has caused in terms of the adoption, especially around regulation of virtual and digital therapeutics, I'm going to be very excited to see in 2021 and 2022 how our understandings of some of the really powerful core technologies underneath the adaptability of digital therapeutics over time are going to interface with the regulatory landscape. Because currently, our understanding is that there's no adaptability allowed, that patients are not allowed to experience very different therapeutics from one another. But one of the most fascinating things about digital therapeutics is that they can become highly personalized. So, understanding where that impetus for personalization meets a regulatory landscape that better is prepared to uh, be a little more experimental with the care we can deliver, to me as an advisor, is exceptionally exciting.
I love that you said that because we get so stuck in the, a large cohort of people that follow us are in the pharmaceutical, medical device, biotech industry. And been a very standardized way that you put somebody on a medication and hope they stick to that for years and years to come. We're not talking about the N=1, so the uber precision, specialization, customization for that particular patient. And again, we're talking about genetic testing and all kinds of ways to enable that to happen. But what you're really saying is that moving into more of this electronic space and digital therapeutics is we could add on, subtract, delete, add, and completely modify in a way that we've never been able to do because of chemical interactions in the way that actually, impacts
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
body per se.
If I go get a prescription filled, every pill in that bottle is going to be identical. But now in a hypothetical 2035 world where SAMD pathways are coming to increasingly dominate more and more of the regulatory action that the FDA does, I'm imagining a digital therapeutic that every experience I'm having in it is a little better tailored to the current state of my condition and my well being compared to the last time I used it. And that adaptability would be as if every pill in my bottle were a little different every time I took it to get my maximum impact and efficacy out of the therapeutic. That can't be done with chemistry, at least by our current understandings and distribution models, but that can be done in digital therapeutics. And
Yeah.
we were having a call with a client the other day. And I think one of the most fascinating ideas that came out of that call is that from not just a care standpoint, but a diagnostics standpoint too, one of the real holy grails, so to speak, of digital therapeutics is to take natural interactions. The idea that you and I are just having a conversation right now, and by breaking them down into quantifiable data streams that measure things, for example, like our cadence or our prosody or our word complexity or our speech rate, be able to use those data biomarkers, so to speak, as the basis on a regression model of performing something like diagnostics. What does it mean to take the totally natural, as you said, the ambient biometrics from our daily naturalistic lives and transform those into meaningful, externally validatable, clinically valid diagnostic parameters. That to me is one of the holy grails of all of these technologies, and one of the most exciting things I think that we could be looking forward to in 10 years.
What I think really is exciting about what you're saying is it's possible that all of this can completely change the business model that currently exists with the life sciences space. So getting away from the sickness model to the wellness model, you keep mentioning flourishing, human well-being. So this idea around diagnostics kind of fits into this, because my question to you is the point of care, the Alexas, the Nests of the world, your TV, the couch that you sit on,
Yeah,
all of
all of
these
these
sort
can
of
be part
ambient
of your
sensors.
all of them. All of these can be part of this as amorphous care network around you that is not no longer just your physician, your family, your community, but now it's the stuff. It's the physical stuff around you, imbued with both, and this is very important, a sense of intelligence, the ability to collect data and then make a meaningful impact and effect back against you, but also a properly aligned incentive structure, that these are built and regulated and monetized in ways that are aligned with keeping you well for non-commercial reasons, but just because that's what we owe each other as human beings.
But
That to
it's
me,
interesting, because it's interesting though, because one of the questions come down to is, if you are leveraging these tools, is behavioral engineering, could this actually preempt most, I'm going to suggest 80 to 90% of the downscale conditions, cardiovascular, respiratory, autoimmune? Could you actually prevent a lot of those so that you never need to go down the chemical compound route?
that's the hope, is that behavioral engineering in digital therapeutics, this idea that we understand what sort of change a patient wants out of their lives. We have their consent to use these, what would otherwise be described as advanced coaching or advanced nudging methodologies, but really under the hood have a vast amount of back-end intelligence to them and under scientific frameworks behind them, implementing those to help people of their own accord and aligned with the change they want become this better, healthier, safer version of themselves before their conditions become that of, okay, now I'm seeking more formal care. That is one of the end goals. Absolutely.
I absolutely love it. Super exciting information, and the whole idea around these digital therapeutics and software as a medical device, everything kind of, and AI and all these really intricate algorithms helping to manage things like anxiety and mental health issues and pain and a series of other things. And so one of the things I did want to ask you really quickly is, you also run a podcast. So you obviously have all the right tools that we're looking at here. And for those of you who are
Yes.
listening, is all the gear. It's actually called Good News You Deserve. So I was just curious about some of the things that you navigate. Some, what was some of the more interesting dialogues that you've had or people that you've had on your show?
So I've got to confess that we filmed our first episode this past Friday. Uh,
Oh,
so it's very new. It's a very new kind of experiment we're running. But it's my co-founder Alex and I. So here's the shtick, so to speak. Um, Look, 2020 has been for some a loss of life and a loss of livelihood. And for all of us who are still trucking through it, it has certainly been one of the most stressful and mentally taxing and emotionally taxing years anyone can remember. And when I think about what I see a lot of people using to kind of emotionally bolster themselves again, to remind themselves that it's going to be okay, it all strikes me as a little fluffy. Like, there's nothing wrong with cat videos on Instagram that put a smile on your face before you go back to, living in a reality that's otherwise increasingly defined by chaos. But you probably deserve better good news than stuff that's, you know, a dog got rescued today. Don't get me wrong, happy for the dog. But we deserve good substantial optimism. And we have good substantial reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot of people out there, men and women around the world, who are continuing to push the envelope against sustainable development using emerging technologies like the ones that we advise on at Qual. And we wanted to use the podcast as a brief way to share bite-sized stories about big reasons to be optimistic, to share the stories of these teams in 5, 6 minute little bites that happen every Friday, to give people a substantial reason to be excited about what we're doing here. Not we qual, but the big we, the human we, that we're still continuing to make progress against the things that we've outlined as some of the most important challenges we face. Because we think that that is what people's optimism can be built out of, that is sustainable and growable and exciting. Because at a certain point, if all of the good in your life is just coming to you from sarcasm, spicy memes, and cute animals on Instagram, that's going to run thin really quick and you're going to run out. So you need something real to be reflecting back on, that we are all collectively going to make it through. The kids are going to be all right.
And I love it. And podcasting is such a great way to attract your own personal tribe globally. I'm a big fan of Eric Weinstein, his podcast called The Portal, a Jolly Swagman from Australia. He actually says it's probably the only channel now that is not being dismissed by cancel culture. So we will navigate that, and I'm sure there will be some exciting shows ahead. I could literally talk to you for hours. We're at the top of the hour, Ramsay.
Likewise.
Super interesting. Like, honestly, this is like navigatable, digestible, double click comment, topics for another
Oh,
day.
thanks.
So,
I love that.
so,
Thank you. Likewise. This has
so
been a blast.
So this has just been awesome. So Ramsay, if people want to get in touch with you, all the companies that we speak to and people who listen to us, they wanted to connect and learn more, where will they be able to find you?
Then go to us at Quol, that's QUOL.ai.
Awesome. And we will leave those in the show notes as well as Ramsay's LinkedIn. If anybody wants to connect with him there, we're happy to do this. So for those of you who are also interested in these courageous conversations, this is what Impetus does, Impetus Digital. Our platform allows for these asynchronous and synchronous touch points with your healthcare stakeholders, with patients, with payers, with other allied healthcare providers. So you can take some of these conversations beyond the pill. What's coming up in AI? What's coming up in digital health? How are you going to be completely rethinking the pharmaceutical business model? Or the life sciences business model? All these really provocative, bleeding edge topics can take place in a longitudinal way using our platform, and that's what we aspire to do. Feel free to like this channel, give it a thumbs up. This is actually how other people are going to find us as well. Share the content, share the love. We love having you all here. Thank you again for everybody's time, Ramsay. This has been a blast, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie. It's really been a pleasure to be here.